Ooh. Oh. Ta-da! Hello everyone. Welcome to the texture coloring demonstration using Blick Studio alcohol markers. Today, I will be applying several of the textures covered in the texture tutorial to a coloring page, and I will be improvising a couple new ones as well. In the beginning, we have the ability to make choices about how, why, or even if we want to color a page. We already know that I will be coloring with textures today, but I want to emphasize the freedom of choice we have in deciding what things are made of in the images we color, and that those choices do not need to be based on mundane reality. If you are coloring along and want to make the shelving in the background bubblegum, the bottles stone, and the walls shredded wheat, have at it. Before we get to coloring, I'm going to apply grayscale to the entire image, and in that grayscale I will be sketching out my textures. The grays I am using for this are warm gray 10% through warm gray 90%, which have a bit of a pale red tint to them. I will also make use of warm black and black. I might also need the colorless blender for erasing or lightening from time to time. As we get started, there are 3 things I want to point out. First, alcohol markers bleed heavily on lighter papers, such as the paper my coloring books are printed on. I have to keep a sheet of paper under the page I'm working on to protect additional pages of the book. The bleed-through coloring that you can see on the left page as I work is the page 7 basic coloring demonstration. Second, I have been using 2 separate coloring books for my demonstrations since the beginning. I color even pages in one book and odd pages in the other, specifically because of the potential for color bleeding through the pages. Third, the books I am coloring in are from a batch I had printed. If you get the PDF download from my Patreon page, you can print individual pages on whatever paper or cardstock you like, so that bleed will be less of an issue for you. Now, let's get on with the texturing. I decide that I want to make the bartender shirt made of fur, and I use warm black to create the shaggy outline of that fur along his shoulders. It looks like it might take a few passes to hide the printed lines of the shoulders with this fur, so I let the first one dry while I tone in the open doorway behind the bartender. I like the idea of making the archway around the open doorway stone or brick, so I draw in the rectangular sections of those stones. Adding some gray to the stones of the archway, I make the underside darker than the outer edge, and then I create more contrast with a black gradient from the upper part of the open doorway. Sticking with some of the design choices I've made on previous pages, I start coloring in the back wall with a splotchy pattern that will eventually become the pitted mud texture I've used previously. Returning to the bartender's shirt, I add a light gray tone and then go over my fur outlines again with black. There are ways of changing the lines without having to resort to black, but those tricks are for another video. I add a light amount of gray shading to the bartender's apron and then go back to working on the fur texture of his shirt. I am making sure to use the short directional strokes for fur. I'm also using darker grays near the outer edges and lighter grays in the areas I want to have lit more directly. Moving on to his hair, I quickly add the dark rear edge, leaving room for some rim lighting, and begin shading the forms of his neck, face, and arms using light grays. It may appear that the grayscale coloring I am doing disappears from time to time, but that is an illusion created by the black lines of the opposing page showing through while wet and disappearing as the ink dries. I try to build up the value rendering of the bartender gradually, with an effort being made to avoid going too dark while also making sure to leave some plain white areas for pure color. With the bartender rendered in grayscale, I move to the background, darkening values and enhancing texture marks. I lay in value and sketch wood grain for both the shelves and the bar itself. Thinking about the lighting of the scene, I add in some cast shadow from the cleric onto the bar and darken the lower portion of the bar counter a bit more. I work on shading in the cleric, creating dark penumbras along the left of her forms and leaving space for the rim lighting, just as I did on the bartender. The light is coming from in front of the characters to the right, so the forward-facing planes of their forms are the lightest. In this pass, I defined the cleric's hair texture, and the ribbon-like trim of her outer robe is shaded with strong highlights, as I intend to make those parts shiny. I begin adding texture to the cleric's outfit, with her shoulder pads and collar. I give them a sort of rough splotchy texture that could be something like pitted metal. I also leave some large white areas for highlight in the closest forward-facing planes. I have decided to texture the cleric's outer robe in my scribbly O chainmail texture. I use darker O's in the shadows and lighter O's towards the highlight, while leaving them completely out of the actual highlight area. Switching to her gloves, I opt for a scale texture of simple U-shaped scales. Again, I use a darker gray for the U's in the shadowy areas, getting lighter near the central front, and leaving the texture out of the purest highlight area. I have opted for a rough fabric texture for the cleric's tunic, which is shown as her sleeves and the cloth running down from her abdomen, under her outer robe. This texture is essentially just gray dots, darker at the edges of forms and lighter or none at all in the highlight. Now that I have a much darker set of values on the cleric, I intensify the values on the bartender to match. His apron gets a little darker in the wrinkles and shadowed areas, the curvature of his muscles gets a little more definition, and some of his facial forms are darkened. I decide that I need some good contrast between the bottles and the inside of the shelving, so I add in a nice dark value to the open space around the bottles. Working through the bottles, I add some shading, labels, and fluid levels. The shading is kept fairly light, though, as these bottles are background details that don't need to have as much contrast as the main characters. I make a few more little adjustments to the bartender's face, and then start working on the stone archway behind him. The open doorway behind the bartender gets darkened just a bit more. At this point, we have completed the grayscale work on the image, established textures in the scene, and determined the basics of our lighting through shading. Now it's time to enhance everything with color. Continuing with color sets I established in the basic coloring demonstration, I use a range of pale yellow to orange-brown in the mud wall, which is exposed behind and around the shelves. I go with some blues in the open doorway behind the bartender, which cools the background a bit, balancing the yellowish mud walls. I also use a mix of blues and lavenders or lilacs in the bottles on the shelves, keeping them simple so they don't clash with the foreground. I make my first pass at the wood shelves, making them more saturated along the deep side by the stone archway, and then color in the bar. The shelves were too close in color and value to the wall, so I made some small tweaks to both elements of the background, making sure to get some dark values along the edges of the shelves where they touch the wall. This could probably have been pushed a bit more by adding another color over either the walls or the shelves to make them just a bit more different from each other. Focusing on the bartender for a while, his fur is colored in a greenish brown tone, while the collar and trim of his shirt are dark green. The apron and rag are toned in with light brown. As a generic and helpful bartender character, I chose to give him medium blonde or light brown hair and a light but not pale skin tone that suggests he might get some sun once in a while, but not too much. It is now time to finish off this page by coloring in the cleric. I start with the collar and shoulder pads or cowl that she is wearing, and these are getting a range of red to pink, but also lit with strong yellow tones from the fireplace that is once again out of sight. If there is any doubt that there is a fireplace somewhere in this building, check back to the basic coloring demonstration where smoke was pouring out of this tavern's chimney. The trim on the cleric's robe and gloves gets the same coloring as the cowl, and I am making sure to leave a strong white highlight in the brightest spots, as it is a shiny material. Using a very pale blue followed by a medium blue, I color in all of the rim lighting on the cleric. As I mentioned earlier, this light is just weak daylight coming through the little window in the tavern door, so it is not that bright or strong. Moving on to the cleric's robe and gloves, I color them in with a range of blues, making sure to leave small highlight areas on the robe, as the material is blue chainmail, while I leave larger highlights on the gloves, as they are a more reflective blue scale mail. As I color both articles of the cleric's clothing, I also use the blues to add more intense color to the scribbly O's and the U's in the scales in their darker areas. Using the lightest blue to outline scales inside the yellow highlight from the fireplace creates pale gray-green lines, which I really like for this coloring. As a final touch of defining the scales and scribbly O's, I use a dark gray and black. This adds much needed contrast to the forms with their bright yellow and white highlights. Coloring in the fabric of the cleric's tunic, I use some really light browns and pale yellows. I want the cloth of the cleric's tunic to feel like chunky cotton or heavy canvas. I'm also using a touch of light periwinkle in the shadowy folds, which adds a subtle, cool violet color to them. The medallion, belt, and belt buckle are colored in with a range of yellow to brown, simulating gold. I work these in from the shadows to the highlight, and then decide to carve a cross into both medallion pieces with a central rounded rivet or bulb. Getting nearer to completion, I color in the cleric's blue lips and green hair. While the initial layer of the hair dries, I add the pale blue rim light along the cleric's face and neck before adding darker details to the hair and finishing it off. The cleric's skin tones are a range of pinks that drift toward violet in the shadows, and as with her clothing, her face and thighs are lit by the yellow light of the fireplace. The final touches on this coloring page include adding the rim lighting around the bartender and coloring in the bottle of liquor he is holding. Looking over the finished coloring page, there is a sense of yellow light playing over the clothing of the cleric. The scene itself seems fairly neutral or peaceful. Can you think of alternate ways to color this scene that might feel more playful? Or maybe even ways that would make it seem sinister? Thank you for watching this video, and thank you to my subscribers and Patreon patrons. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hitting those buttons really helps my little channel grow. I hope you will join me for next week's video, which will be a little different as it combines tutorial and demonstration in creative coloring and mixed medium on another page of my coloring book.